Hi folks, this is the first of two videos when we're going to look at places associated with the last mission of Wing Commander Guy Gibson, VC, DSO Bar, DFC Bar, and his navigator, Squadron Leader Jim Warwick, DFC. If you're not familiar with the name Guy Gibson, then he is very well known or famous in the UK as being perhaps the most famous RAF pilot of the Second World War, because he was commanded 617 Squadron in Operation Chastise, or it's better known as the Dam Busters, when the RAF attacked the German dams in May 1943. And there are many videos and stories associated with that story. But this is more associated with his last mission and the places that you can visit linked with that. Now we're looking at the Petwood Hotel, based in the small town of Woodhill Spa in Lincolnshire, England. Lincolnshire during the Second World War was known as Bomber County because there were so many RAF airfields. And we'll be looking at the previous base of Woodhill Spa. Now, the Petwood Hotel was built in the early 1900s by a lady who was a heiress and a baroness. She'd gone through a messy divorce and she wanted a country retreat. And she built, I think starting with a bungalow, but obviously expanded it, this beautiful house, and she used some of her favourite wood. That's why it's called the Petwood Hotel. When she left, she remarried, and then when she left, it became a hotel in 1933, and it's still a hotel today. So you can come and stay here. If you're not staying, you could have afternoon tea or a meal. And if you're interested in RAF history, and particularly Bomber Command during the Second World War, I would suggest this should be sort of high on your bucket list because it's got so many memories linked to that period. Different squadrons staying here, used it as their base for their pilots and their officers and their mess. 97 Squadron, 619 Squadron, and the famous 617 Squadron, because though they operated from Scampton during the Dambuster raid, in January 1944 they moved to the nearby RAF Woodhall Spa, which we'll visit. So a lot of history and memories attached with the Petwood Hotel. So we're looking at the rear of the property, and as you can see, you will see inside there's many pictures of RAF pilots on the veranda there. It's a really nice place to stay, and as an English country hotel, if you're a visitor from overseas, it would give you a nice flavour of an English country hotel. There's grounds you can walk around. And they've also, which we'll look at, got one of the early prototypes of the bouncing bomb. The bouncing bomb wasn't just a bouncing bomb, it was a spinning bomb. And if you're familiar with the Dam Buster story, it was used against the German dams to try and breach like the Mona Dam, the Sorp Dam and the Ida Dam in May 1943. It was a successful mission in as much as two of the dams were breached. Although there was a large loss of life, both from the RAF, I think lost 56 aircrew on that mission, and also, of course, from the German civilian population and, I believe, Russian prisoners of war who died in the floods. So it was successful because it did shut down, which was the idea, the armaments manufactured in the Ruhr, because these dams supplied the water. But with the usual German efficiency, they got them back up and running. I think by September, they'd been repaired. So it was successful, but it came at a fairly heavy price. So as I said, you can stay here, or you can just, if you're passing by in the vicinity, you can come in and have an afternoon tea, and we'll be showing the old bar and mess area, which is definitely worth a visit if you're interested in Guy Gibson or Bomber Command in general during the Second World War. So you can see some very nice grounds that you can walk around in. Now, I visited here a couple of years ago now, 2023. So it's been a little while since I filmed this because I've only just completed the second part of the story in the Netherlands. So, but I looked online, it's still open, it's still available. So you can visit it today, and I'm sure, some parts that haven't changed very much since the Second World War, which we'll be taking a look at. And in one corner, they've actually got one of the early prototypes of the bouncing bomb that was used on the Dam's raid. So we'll be taking a look at that in a moment. And there we have it. This is the one of the remaining prototypes. Invented by Barnes Wallis, of course, a famous inventor, came up with the idea. And again, how does that work? Well, it was the idea similar to if you've ever thrown a stone in the sea or a lake and you see it bounce. That was the concept. The bomb was spinning. It had to be released at a certain height, which was very low, and then it would bounce across the water and avoid the anti-torpedo nets that the Germans had placed to stop any attacks. Then hit the wall of the dams. It would then sink to a predetermined level, and the hydrostatic pistol then set off the charge, Amatol charge. Combined with the water pressure, they hoped that would then crack the dams, which it did. It worked. It was successful. Okay, we're now looking inside what was the officers' mess or officers' bar, and lots of memorabilia here. You can buy your drink in the let's call it the proper bar, and then you can just come and sit in here with your drink, or just come and sit in here and absorb the atmosphere. It is one of these places which, if the walls could talk, the stories that would come out, because of course many men, including Guy Gibson, would have visited this bar at some stage, especially if they were staying in the hotel, and then never returned from missions. So they've got a lot of memorabilia in here, and it's been kept. I think there is a picture which we'll see of the actual wartime bar, and it's very, very similar, very similar. There's Barnes Wallis, the famous inventor. There's some of the famous captains, pilots of 617 Squadron. Guy Gibson there, second on the right. Leonard Cheshire. There's a bit of a picture. I didn't take a very good shot there of the bar during the war. Should have taken that a bit clearer, actually. As you can see, though, it's not changed all that much, apart from obviously there's all these photographs now and letters and just memorabilia. So, you could spend a lot of time in here just looking at all these pictures and photographs and letters. I'm just trying to give you a feel of what actually you can see in this bar. A year on from the raid, which was May 1943, they held a party to commemorate that, but unfortunately Guy Gibson wasn't able to attend that. He was busy doing other things at the time. So again, some pictures of it as it looked during the Second World War. Obviously, they converted some of the bedrooms to take a lot more beds, I think up to 6 beds, because obviously there was a lot of crew that was staying in the hotel. During the First World War, it had been used as a place for officers who were being invalided out from the Western Front. It became a hotel in the 1930s, and then it was taken over again during the Second World War. But I'm glad to say it's now still kept as a hotel to this day, which is good. After the dams raid, Guy Gibson did a number of things. He went on a public relation tour to America because 1943, May 1943, was still in the dark days of the Second World War, and it was seen as a real publicity story for the British. There's a famous picture of Guy with his dog, whose name I can't say on YouTube, but if you know the story, you'll know that name. Fortunately, his dog, who was a black Labrador, was killed, but he used that name as the code if they'd breached the dams. So he was able to transmit his name when they did breach the dams in Germany. And he's buried at what was RAF Scampton, which is now closed, of course. That closed in recent years. And there is, again, flying helmet, an old newspaper from the time, like the Daily Telegraph, because this was seen as a real publicity event for the RAF and Britain. They were able to use that, particularly again with the Americans. I think Winston Churchill in particular liked to use this story. And Guy Gibson accompanied him to America, and he actually met President Roosevelt. One of the story goes that he was asked how many missions he'd undertaken. And at this time, the RAF Bomber Command, 30 missions was seen to be very difficult to achieve because the attrition rate was so bad. And the American 8th Air Force was, again, very high attrition rate. And they were on 25 missions before they were rotated. And when he was asked how many he'd done over 170 missions. And he was only 26 when he died. Incredible. Apart from being on the bombers, he'd been on night fighters at one stage of his career. And he was chosen to be the wing commander of 617 Squadron because of his personality and his experience. That's the Tirpitz. Now, 617 Squadron then moved from Scampton to Woodhill Spa in January 1944. They carried on, Guy Gibson moved on, but they then carried on with their missions, and they sank the Tirpitz using a special bomb called the Tall Boy. Now, this is an interesting story. This is a bough of a tree, look, which has again been here since the Second World War. And this relates to an attack on the Tirpitz, where the planes had to land in northern Russia and refuel. And one of them had problems with the Merlin engines, and the plugs fouling up the engines weren't clear. So they struggled to take off. And during the takeoff, this bow went through the cockpit of the plane. And they had to fly back to the UK with that sticking out of the fuselage. And so they brought it back and they put it in the bar. I mean, that's just yet again one of how many close shaves crews had during this period. Obviously, many were lost, but the ones who weren't lost had so many near misses and suffered just by pure chance that they survived sometimes when their comrades didn't. So that's been hanging in this bar ever since 1944. Incredible. So yeah, Guy Gibson had completed over 170 missions at the time of his death. Squadron leader Jim Warwick, I think, had also completed a tour. And what we're looking at now is centre of Woodhill Spa, this small town. It was a spa town, that's where it gets its name from. And there's a memorial there in the centre. Originally this was the site of a hotel, but during the Second World War the Germans dropped a parachute mine on the hotel, killed 2 civilians. There was a lot of, apart from RAF personnel, there was a lot of army personnel in this area as well. And you can walk around Woodhill Spa and look at various locations associated with the army. This story is really just associated with Guy Gibson and Jim Warwick's last flight and what happened to them over in the Netherlands. So there's a memorial to 617 Squadron. And apart from the Petwood Hotel, of course, there are other locations you can stay at in Woodhill Spa in Lincolnshire. So we'll be moving on to look at what was the airfield and is now closed. It's now a wildlife centre, so we'll be taking a look at that. Okay, so we're now visiting what was RAF Woodhall Spa. It's now run by the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, and we'll be seeing there's a lot of bird wildlife here. After it finished with the RAF, it became an area for quarries, and there's gravel pits, so there's wildlife on the gravel pits. If you want to visit here, there is a gate. It's only pedestrians only. It's free to come in. There is a gate, but you need the PIN code to enter that. And there's a phone number you have to call. Now, that's only open during the week. You know, it's the sort of 9 till 5 operation, and they close at lunchtime. So if you're going to visit at the weekend, you'd need to call them before then to get that code. So just be aware of that. And I'll link in the description, I'll link that number for you to call. And we're going to be walking down what was one of the old main runways. And at the end, there is a memorial to the various crews that were here. And as I said, 617 Squadron operated from here. That's when they took off for the Tirpitz, etc. But Guy Gibson wasn't operating from here. He was at nearby RAF Conisbee, with what was called 54 Base. And they were a unit that was helping with marking the targets. At this stage of the war, we're now talking September 1944, the RAF, of course, had got a very advanced techniques for marking targets in Germany with pathfinders, marking for the main force, and then a controller or master bomber to help coordinate. And on the 19th of September 1944, an order came through to attack Bremen in Germany on a night raid, but that was then changed to the secondary targets, which was Mönchengladbach and I think if that's pronounced correctly, part of Mönchengladbach. And it was quite a complicated raid, I believe, that there were going to be 3 different areas, green markers, red markers. Now, Guy Gibson, who seems to be one of these men that just, had to carry on. He wanted to fly again before the war had finished. He'd been beyond a desk to a certain extent, helped writing a book called Enemy Coast Ahead, but he was very keen to keep on flying. He'd been posted to Conisbee's 54 Base. And on this particular day, he decided that he was going to be the operation controller flying a Mosquito aircraft. Now, his aircraft at Conisbee, well, there wasn't a Mosquito available. So, together with a navigator called Jim Warwick, who wasn't his regular navigator, came over to RAF Woodhill Spa. And we'll just take a look at the memorial before I carry on with that story. When you visit these old airfields, they do have an atmosphere about them, because obviously before the war they were farmland or whatever, and now a lot of them are returning to those sort of situations. And as this poem says, and you can freeze the film and watch it, the concrete disappears over time, but their deeds remain, and that's very true. The bravery of the men that were here still lives on. And of course today it's quite I won't say desolate place, that's not quite the right word, but a place on its own. And I'm just capturing there was a lot of fighter activity that day. I think the Typhoons from Conisbee seemed to be very active, and I just took a picture of whatever that aircraft is flying over. But they do have a certain atmosphere about these old airfields. So Guy Gibson and Jim Warwick came over to RAF Woodhall Spa, and he didn't take the reserve aircraft for some reason. He decided not to do that, and he took another Mosquito. So when Guy Gibson arrived at Woodhill Spa at about 1830 hours, this is on the 19th of September 1944, for some unknown reason he rejected the reserve aircraft, which was KB213, and he insisted on using a different Mosquito, KB267. Now that had already been allocated to another crew, and I don't think they were very happy that he decided to take their aircraft, so to speak. And they were performing different functions, so the bomb loads had to be swapped. So finally, they took off at 1951 hours, when they flew over to Germany to act as the main controller on this raid to Mönchengladbach. It seems that raid didn't go according to plan. There was different markings, and in the end Gibson had to instruct the main force to drop their bombs on the green marks rather than, I think, the red marks. And his time of departure from the target is a bit unknown. He may have swanned around, as they used to say, to assess the outcome, and he left around 2200 hours. Now, one crew from number 67 Squadron claimed they heard him say that he had a damaged engine. But was that the case? Well, the next part of the video is going to be the second video, which takes place in the Netherlands. So where he crashed together with his navigator and were both killed, and where he's buried in the local cemetery. So I hope you can join me on the second video, where we actually look at where the last mission ended for Guy Gibson and Jim Warwick.